This is Architecture 360. I'm Lee Bay. Chicago, America's first city of architecture, is celebrating that heritage a lot these days. The city hosted a 3-month architectural biennial and is already planning the next one for 2016. New skyscrapers are popping up across the Loop, and a planned museum by Star Wars creator George Lucas and the upcoming Barack Obama Presidential Library will be adding to that heritage in one way or another. But the town of Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe was also a world leader in urban planning for much of the 20th century. But that legacy, many fear, is at risk. Joining me now are John DeVries and Brad Hunt, authors of the book Planning Chicago. The book looks at Chicago's planning history, but also asks the question, has Chicago lost its groove when it comes to urban planning? Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, Lee. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Lee.
So, let's sort of begin with kind of what's happening now, which is the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Did it pay enough attention to urban planning, do you think? John?
The exhibits at the Cultural Center, I think you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the architects there were saying it's not enough to do the building. We have to talk about the context, and we have to talk about the neighborhoods, and we have to talk about the city. So I saw a lot of architects trying to reach out to that broader context of what the social impact of their design is going to be. So in that sense, I thought it was quite helpful. Yeah.
A lot of that context that John's talking about was at the neighborhood level. So I saw a lot of interesting block by block, or maybe 12 block area context for certain projects that were being proposed. You didn't see the concept of planning and the importance of process and things like that. My perception is that to many architects, the process of planning is burdensome as opposed to the actual the process of figuring out what should go on a specific site. I think that I saw that. It was an architectural biennial, not a planning biennial in that respect. I thought there were lots of really interesting creative ideas that I don't know if they can or will be built, but conceptually, I think it's great that Chicago's embracing architecture as part of its identity in a way, and putting on a biennial. I thought bringing people from around the globe will always help in some way that is probably not very measurable.
Now let's jump in and talk about the book a bit. And in a way, what we just talked about sets it up pretty nicely, because it seems like either urban planning was missed entirely or not really taken care of in the scale that it probably could have been in a place like this. Is that a metaphor for what you talk about in the book, which is somehow in this city of great architecture, things are getting built? I've said to you before, we've talked about before, you can't even put a dormer on your bungalow without somebody invoking the name of Daniel Burnham. Yeah. But with all this stuff getting built, is planning as well done now as it has been in the past? Yeah,
lots of conversations about individual buildings or individual blocks, but not enough about how are we going to systematically bring residents, planners, government, the public sector, the private sector, bankers, developers, all at the table to think about what should the future of the city be in the long run. We got to this point we got to a point where downtown is now thriving in many respects. There's some problems, but downtown is thriving in many respects. We got there in part because we did a whole lot of forward-thinking planning from the 1950s through the 1980s, really the 1970s more, in ways that it came to fruition. And now, where are we going to be 30 to 40 years from now? We don't really know.
Let's go back in time a little bit and talk about how important it is to get those building blocks set up. We go back to the Burnham Plan. Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett. Chicago was a growing city. They thought at that time in 1909 it could be a city of 8 million people at one point. And, how do you put beauty and order in this city?
Yes. So the 1909 Burnham Plan, Burnham and Bennett, really laid out a vision of the city beautiful, that the city was kind of a messy conglomeration of industrial and waterfronts that were working waterfronts and railroad tracks running through all parts of the city. And they said they wanted the city to be a much more attractive, visually attractive place, much like Paris had rebuilt. So there's a great vision there, and it's simply city beautiful. We're going to make this place attractive, lovely, You're going to want to walk around. You're going to want to promenade around. Great. I mean, that's a simple, straightforward vision, and it leads to the lakefront. It leads to Wacker Drive to clean up the river. It leads to many of the park space. It leads to these boulevards that were supposed to. Not all of them got built. Most of it didn't get built, but it had a vision. Mm-hmm. All right. In the 1950s, it was a vision to save downtown, to protect and make sure downtown was a vital place. It was pretty straightforward, simple vision. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the vision is today. Is it to just attract more Fortune 500 companies? Is it what's the vision today? It's a reactive approach to governance as opposed to a visionary and a proactive form. Where the mayor could say, I want to bring people to the table and let's have this conversation. And for him, I totally get from his perspective. That's too far out. He's not. That's not who he is. That's not. Mm-hmm. That's not the kind of way he's ever governed. When you've been a White House chief of staff and you've been a investment banker, you're very much looking to that next quarter, to look 3 to 5 to 10 years out when you're not even going to perhaps be in the office. Strikes him as probably an indulgent or just not something he needs to worry about. And without that, though, all these long-term capital investments, all these long-range plans for neighborhoods, all the ideas of what you want to do to help make the city better in the long run, you can't get to that. You don't lay the groundwork for that kind of hard work of saying, where do we want the school system to be in 5 to 10 years, and how do we get there? Where do we want our transit system to be 20 years from now, and how do we get there? Mm-hmm. Where do we want our other infrastructure? What do we want to see happen in neighborhoods like Englewood or Roseland or Austin or Rogers Park? Where do we want to see them 10 to 20 years from now, and what will they look like? And that's just not on the table.
Now, we're laying a lot of this at the blame of Rahm Emanuel, who's been mayor for a term in a year or so, but was Rich Daley, his predecessor, and my former boss, for full disclosure, was he any better, particularly in the last term or two?
Well, Richard M. Daley certainly put in place some groundbreaking projects that had an impact. Millennium Park, I think, covered many other shortcomings, and it's been an outstanding success. But I think the diminution of planning did begin during the Richard M. Daley era, and the planning department became more of an administrative kind of function. There were plans done. We did the Central Area Plan during that time frame, Central Area Action Plan. But as you know, you were sitting in the mayor's office at that time, very little of that was implemented or converted into capital plans, converted into those kind of things that result in the roads and the schools and the neighborhood projects that Brad was talking about. Very little of that. Yeah.
But it wasn't obviously, as we're talking, it wasn't always this way. You look back to 1957, Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley, the father of Richard M., creates really the first planning department in the professional planning department, really in the country, supposedly, right?
It was one of the early professionalized departments of city planning in the country. It was not the first, but he brought together talent and said, I want the best people in the country to be in my planning department. And you were saying, John, he recruited who again?
Dean Macris, who had done the Baltimore plan, came here and presided over the 1958 plan and the beginnings of the 66 plan, then moved on to San Francisco and did their very successful comprehensive. I mean, we forget San Francisco was in the doghouse in the 1950s, and so we were attracting that kind of talent. He also pulled the best talent he could out of IIT and University of Illinois. He tapped those universities for their brain power to come down and form the city. I think and Brad discovered in the course of doing our research a wonderful speech that he made to what was then the American Institute of Planners, a predecessor of the American Planning Association here in Chicago. And he stood up and said, we want to make Chicago a modern city, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to create this planning department. And we're going to bring in the best talent that we can from all over the world if we have to. And within a year, he put the department in place, made all the department heads bring their plans in conformance with what the planning department was coming up with, and so on. And within a year, we had a 1958 plan that ended up being a very effective plan for the downtown.
And it guided development for the next 2-3 decades. And even the follow-on plans and other plans that came along were still in that same model. And so by professionalizing the department, it really gave some direction and gave some discipline, if you will, to how the city ended up developing. In other cities, and I think it's important to think here for a second about how Chicago's trajectory in the post-war period after 1945, how it, like all the cities, struggled with declines in manufacturing, suburbanization. But yet Chicago emerges in a much different shape than St. Louis, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Detroit, particularly, other cities that didn't have a strong planning vision in the after World War II, particularly in that 1950s period, and ended up kind of drifting and even sinking in some instances. And so, the planning isn't the whole thing here. I'm not going to put it all on the planners, but this makes, I argue, and John and I argue, makes a difference when you have a vision, a plan that says, here's what we want to do. It gives you that governmental organizational discipline you need to get there in the long run.
Well, I think it gives you one other thing, if I can bring it in, is planning done properly is a way of involving the citizenry in their future. Mm-hmm. And you alluded to that earlier, Brad, that there's a process to it. It's not just the experts coming up with the right answers. And I think we're a city that's very much in need of involving the citizenry in where we're going. There's a lot of polarization. There's emerging a tale of two cities here between the prosperity of the central area and the despair of the south side and sections of the west side. And we're going to have to involve the citizenry in this to solve these problems. And planning is certainly a one mechanism for doing that, for them saying, here are the goals we want, and working with them. And I think, frankly, if the public understands goals, they're willing to understand you have to pay for them too. You have to go back to this public and say, we're going to have to raise tax revenues for this. We're going to have to go to the private sector and ask for contributions. We may have to sell some bonds. One of the footnotes of the whole Burnham plan was that for the next decade and a half, the city sold a record level of bonds to put all these public improvements in with great public acclaim. The public really wanted these things to happen. I think the public consensus on where we want to be as a city is badly torn right now. I think planning could be one of the mechanisms where we re-engage the citizenry in the future.
We're talking to John DeVries, director of the Marshall Bennett Institute of Real Estate at Chicago's Roosevelt University, and Brad Hunt, vice president for research and academic programs for Chicago's Newberry Library. They are authors of Planning Chicago, the book we're talking about today. John, I want to talk about the Tale of Two Cities here that's happening now, which is really more... I mean, I grew up in the city. I was born here, and I've never felt it more than I felt it now.
Well, I think it's interesting that the administration is in its own mind functioning with the plan. It's interesting to say during the first few months of their administration, they got the World Business Chicago to put together. I think they called it a plan for economic growth and jobs.
That's right.
It was a fine plan, and I think whenever anyone was asked what's the plan, they would cite this. And how did it bring those down to the street where people could see that these are turning into projects and departments were working on them? We have to begin some serious investment in these neighborhoods, and a lot of these neighborhoods are suffering from poor access issues. We're still unfortunately suffering from something that wasn't particularly the fault of the city and probably couldn't have been addressed by the city alone, in this horrible foreclosure crisis that we went through. We had, I think we had at one time 40% of the homes owned by black families were, quote, underwater because of the declining property values. We're going to have to step back and say, how do we get this housing stock back on track? And how do we bring more commercial development into those areas? But we're certainly seeing some unpleasant results from not having addressed some of these neighborhood level issues for a long, long time. Yeah.
And when some groups have done neighborhood planning, one of the interesting aspects is that every one of the plans always mentions, in a holistic way, it's not just jobs and buildings, and yes, those are extremely important, but it also mentions relations with the police. And so this recent crisis in Chicago around policing has been long been known, but long been unaddressed, where there's simply a no confidence problem on many community members with the way the Chicago Police Department, its operations, the way it acts. And I'm hoping that this time finally we're going to get some reform around that. But it's been clear from the early 2000s and probably even before that distrust then leads to distrust of other elements of government and probably infects the whole way citizens see their schools, their water department. They don't trust anybody at some level. And then 200,000 African Americans leave Chicago in the last decade because they're fed up with it at some level.
That is a good point. We've talked about this on this show before. That is seismic. I mean, that's of a scale of white flight from the city back when I was a kid. I mean, that many people just sort of get up and it's likely going to happen. It could likely happen again.
We're definitely going to lose more in this decade.
Yeah, the 1966 plan, interestingly enough, headlined white flight as a citywide problem. Mm-hmm. I guess if you wrote one now, you could headline black flight.
Exactly.
And accompanying that, unfortunately, has been a downturn in immigration caused by short-sighted national. We're a pawn of some of the national policies changing too. We don't have the flow of federal money coming into the cities that we did. We understand that, and we don't have the immigration because of a very short-sighted immigration policy, which really fueled the population growth in the 1990s was a lot of immigration.
And immigration has fueled the population of Chicago for 150 years. And so all cities, it's very interesting, most cities rely on a steady stream of immigrants to fuel that central core, and then people move on, move up, move around. We have now been attracting some returnees, some affluent returnees to this central area core and to the lakefront areas. But without a steady stream of migrants, wherever they come from, and I don't care where they come from, and in the past we never cared where they came from. First they came from Germany, then they came from Italy, then they came from Russia. I mean, we did
Mississippi.
Then they came from Mississippi.
A lot from Mississippi.
Now they come from Mexico. Now they're going to come from Asia. And
they might come from Syria.
I think a smart city would say a lot of those Syrians are well educated, fleeing, and want to are hardworking. And boy, I don't know why we'd turn them away. That's another debate.
Let's go back a bit and. We talked about the benefit of having a strong planning department, how this city really benefited from that. Why wouldn't a mayor, whether it's Richard M. halfway through his term or beyond, or Rahm Emanuel or any other mayor, why wouldn't they want this? Why wouldn't they read that part of your book and say, I want that, I'm going to create it right now?
Well, just think of where we would be today if the strong commitment had been made 5 years ago to say, let's have a citywide planning process and decide together where we're going to go as a city. Be awfully handy if I were a mayor to be able to pull that out now and say, we've made X, Y, and Z progress and we have 4 more steps to go and so on and so forth. So a good plan in my mind would be the mayor's best friend. And it's something he can cite. It can be a way of him articulating some of his vision as well. And sharing it with the public and letting the public participate in it. To me, it makes all the sense in the world that he would see this as a win-win.
It's a long-term investment, and the mayors tended not to be as long-term in that respect. And what was his strategy when he came in? Well, it was turn to his Rolodex and call the people that he knew. And the strategy was bring in some more Fortune 500 companies. That's the plan to revive Chicago. And every time somebody came in, there'd be a press release and a press conference, and he would tout, so-and-so, some company is moving to Chicago. And that's not that as one element of a strategy, fine. But if that's the only thing, then you're really not creating a vision for what the city could be like.
Now let's talk a little bit more about the book. What's been the response? Well, let me back up first. What good ideas? Talk about the good ideas that are in this book that need currency now, that people need to, if you're going to the planning department of the mayor's office right now and saying, look, read page 12, read 15, what would you show them?
Well, there's a couple quick things. The city did have a comprehensive industrial retention policy, maybe the biggest in the country. I think we ended up designating dozens of planned manufacturing districts around the city. And there has been an internal planning effort at the city, I think Chicago Sustainable Industries. But I would say that the proposals coming out of that need to be much more dramatic and need to be put into practice. Some of these corridors are past saving. They should be returned to the normal land use patterns. Others show great promise for new kinds of businesses, business services and technology businesses, and the kind of stuff we're seeing in Fulton Market and the Kinsey Corridor and so on and so forth. And we should take some of the vision of smokestack only. We should adapt our thinking about those corridors, because a lot of those corridors were the corridors that fed employment into those adjacent neighborhoods, and it's hard to sever what happens to that population from what happens to the employment opportunities. And I think we need a pretty thorough rethinking and modernization of what we're doing in all of those corridors. I alone won't do it, but I don't think they're living up to their potential anymore. In fact, some of the statistics we cited in the book is we were experiencing more severe job loss in the corridors than we were in the city at large. So clearly we're doing something wrong.
I think the other big piece would be transit. And great cities have great transit. Transit brings the density to a community that then gives the vibrancy that people like in cities. They like that hustle and bustle. Transit makes that possible. It makes it possible for a lot of people to live in a more concentrated space. It also addresses some traffic problems. So people say they don't like traffic. Well, if you don't have transit, you're going to have traffic problems. Transit also helps protect the core of downtown, that energy that comes from having all the workers in a general space. Even in this 21st century when we can all telecommute around the world, we know that people need to get together, and a transit plan can do that. Now, transit is very expensive, but other cities have figured out how to do the planning that wins the federal grants, that gets people on board for the quarter-cent sales tax increase, et cetera, to get these things done. All the great cities of the world, they all have really strong transit systems. Ours is good. It needs to be better.
We're talking to John DeVries, director of the Marshall Bennett Institute of Real Estate at Chicago's Roosevelt University, and Brad Hunt, vice president for research and academic programs for Chicago's Newberry Library. They're the authors of Planning Chicago. Now, Chicago, as we talk now, has a relatively new planning commissioner. He's hitting the ground now. What should he be doing?
Well, the structure of the department now tells a story, and it would have to be it's a department that will have to be substantially empowered, and we do call for that in the book. Let's have a department that still is consulted by all the other departments when decisions are made. I thought the lack of department planning in some of the recent decisions, you see headline after headline about where's the library going to go? Where is this museum going to go? What kind of redevelopment should the Children's Hospital site have? What's going to happen to the USX? There's headline after headline going on with no reference whatsoever to the plans, or no one from the planning department speaking out on, say there should be, planning should be involved in these decisions. They shouldn't just be mayoral office decisions, then shaped by a press corps. So I would say that I'd love to see him step up and start being a public voice for planning and not coinciding with that, really advocating for a repowering and a refranchising, if you will, of the department in the city hall decision-making process. And you may have to do some serious head knocking to get the resources to do that.
Brad, and just so the listeners are clear, I didn't actually say who the guy was. The new commissioner of planning is David Riefman, who's a longtime zoning attorney. He's been involved in many big deals around the city over the past 20, 25 years. But Brad, you had some input on this?
Yes. David Riefman is the new planning commissioner, and I'm sure he's a very smart guy, but he's a zoning lawyer. And if we equate planning with zoning, we're going to miss a whole lot. Yes, these individual developments are complicated deals that we would want a zoning lawyer involved with, but unless he's got that broader vision for what the city's going to be, then we've really got a skilled bureaucrat as opposed to a visionary. And I think that's a difference there that we need to think about. In the past, in the 20th century, Chicago got to where it is today in part because it had a strong sense that planning mattered. And it's not clear today that planning matters. John's exactly right, that when things are in the press or things are discussed nationally, nobody even uses the word planning. There's not a sense that, well, how does this development, how does this question fit into a broader set? So then we kind of drift, and it becomes every museum or every library question becomes kind of a mini referendum without any criteria for evaluating these things, or any principles behind it, or any civic purpose that might be addressed.
For the spirit of full disclosure, that we're going to talk about two museums that are on tap. One is the planned Lucas Museum for Narrative Art, and the other is the Obama Presidential Library, which will be a museum and archives and that kind of thing. And for full disclosure to the listeners, for the Lucas Museum, I was a member of the site selection committee that was appointed by the mayor of the task force, the 12-member selection committee that selected the lakefront site near Soldier Field, near 18th Street or so, that is now the subject of a lawsuit. So blame 1/12 of that on me if you must, but have to sort of disclose that so people can know.
I think you used the right word. There was a task force, and then there's a task force for this and a task force for that. I don't recall hearing the planning commissioner expressing an opinion on these location choices. By the way, I'd like to add a third major development that I think hasn't gotten as far up on the radar screen as it could, and that is the designation of Pullman as a national memorial.
Good point. Good point.
And to me, it's going to be a hugely catalytic project for the south side of Chicago. And we're already seeing with David Doiggs and the Pullman development down there recently announcing some of the food anchors coming in, the opening of the method manufacturing plant, the greenhouse, and AIA sponsored a fabulous charrette this spring on what program components could be put in here that could be successful and have the biggest impact on the community. So I would like to see that one elevated. And by the way, I think that's one of the successes of this current national administration and the city working together. That's been a long time coming. So we should be doing more of it. We should be doing it for more areas.
Good point. Brad?
Gosh, so much to talk about. Can we go back to the Obama Library?
Yes.
I think that's a very interesting subject. Here's a large project, tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars, that could be an anchor for community development. And I'm not sure if we're talking about it in those ways. Maybe we are. Maybe you know more than I do, Lee. But that's going to be this major investment that could revitalize Washington Park, could create all sorts of job opportunities, could actually interconnect with the neighborhood in very interesting ways, given the subject matter. And yet I don't see that as part of the conversation. What I see is, are we taking X acres of land, or what's the parking going to be? I don't see the conversation being in that broader neighborhood context in the same way. It could be an economic engine. It needs a plan, and I don't see the plan. As a part of a neighborhood context, and I think that's what's missing here.
John DeVries, Brad Hunt, authors of Planning Chicago. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lee.
Thanks very much.
And I'm Lee Bay. Thank you for listening to Architecture 360. Join me next time.